Thank you so much to all of you. As Paul said, we had a very, I think, engaging, which is good, conversation yesterday. And I'm here speaking about geopolitics. And as you know, geopolitics is a compound word. The first word is geo, and the second part is? Yes. And so in politics, different people have different perspectives. And the goal of being in a community such as this is that we all need to communicate with one another and to share our perspectives, and that's how we learn, and that's how we grow. And I'm here as a speaker, but I feel I have a lot to learn from all of you, and I welcome the input, and I look forward to our sharing. And if I say something that anybody disagrees with, that's great. It means you're paying attention, and we can have that conversation. And so, as you know, my first talk was about genetics and biotechnology. I know a number of you are reading some of my books, and we're going to, on the last C Day on January 3rd, we're going to have a conversation and an interactive dialogue on the ethical issues of genetic engineering and biotech more broadly. Yesterday, I gave a talk on 14,000 years of Asian history to give a broad overview of how we arrived in the world that we're in today. And today I'm going to give a little more of a focused talk, focusing on China. And China is, as you all know, extremely important. There was a time, maybe 30 years ago, where if you thought of yourself as an educated person, there was a list of what you kind of needed to know about. And Europe was on that list, and maybe Shakespeare was on that list. But I think for many of us in this room, 30 years ago, China wasn't really on that list. It was interesting. You might want to learn a little bit about it. But you didn't, I think many people in the West didn't feel you had to really study China and understand China in order to be an educated, informed person in the world. Our world has now changed for reasons that I'm going to describe. And now, if you're not thinking about China almost every day, if you're not thinking about China civilizationally, economically, politically, you're missing something that's very important in the world. And to be an engaged global citizen in today's world, we all need to constantly be learning about everything, but particularly learning about China. And so my talk today is about the changes in the world that are resulting from China's rise. And I'd like to start with a quote from my favorite Italian communist, Antonio Gramsci, which is, "The old world is dying, the new world has not yet emerged, and in the twilight rise up monsters." And I talked a bit about this yesterday. We know what this post-war world looks like. It's the world that America and allies and others built in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second World War. And we can imagine what a post-American world might look like. And we've had little germs of that world in our history and in our recent past. And you can imagine a world where all countries stepped up in a world of sovereign equality where everybody tried to do their part. There wasn't one or two countries that were required to provide public goods that benefited everybody else. But that old world is beginning to decay for the reasons that we talked about yesterday, and that decay is happening much more quickly than I think many of us would have anticipated. And that new world has not yet been created. And so we're in this very, very dangerous transitional period where the old structure is breaking down and there's nothing to replace it. And that's why I was saying yesterday, and I'll say more, this is an extremely dangerous period in international affairs. The good news is it's not at all dangerous on this cruise, so you should all relax and enjoy. So when we think back to history and the role of China, we can all get into a big trouble depending on where we start our clock. Because if you start your clock in about 1800 or 1850, you just think, well, Europeans have always been these dominant cultures. There was Europe, and then there were these other civilizations that really didn't amount to as much. But that's totally wrong. There was a 1,000-year period from roughly to the 6th to the 16th century, where the East was far more developed in most ways than the West. And that was why you have the stories of Marco Polo and others, that it was going from Europe that it was less developed, less advanced, less enlightened, going to the East, where there were these great civilizations of China, of India, of Persia. And I like to use this image because the big ship in the back is a treasure ship. So 80 years before Columbus, Admiral Zheng He, the great Chinese admiral, had an armada of 300 ships and 3,000 sailors, and went all around the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean, down the coast of Africa, and it was just this overwhelming experience for everybody who encountered that. And this little tiny ship in the front, that's the Santa Maria, which was Columbus 80 years later, 3 ships, 90 disease-ridden men. And when you look at this, there's 2 different lessons that you can draw from. If many Chinese people might look at this and say, 80 years before Columbus, China had ship technology that was significantly greater than what existed in the West, and that is correct. And when you look at it from a Western perspective, you say, yes, your ship was better, but around that time, China turned inward and banned the creating of ships, the building of these kinds of ships. And Columbus, when he sailed, was sailing off of the known map. The treasure ships went on the known map. And so there was a thing, it's a cultural statement about risk-taking, about just different civilizational approaches. And so from a Western perspective, you could say, yeah, but at around the 15th century, that's when, for reasons that I described yesterday, the West started in this superdrive of political revolution, leading to scientific revolution, leading to industrial revolution, leading to the period of global dominance. But it's important when we think about history to think in terms of mental maps, because if we, and I think everybody in this room is coming from the West, if we approach other cultures as if they are not these great civilizations that for long stretches of time were greater civilizations than ours, I think we're disrespecting those cultures, and we're denying ourselves the opportunity to really be open-minded about what we can learn about living differently, being differently, and putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And this is the same point said a different way, but at the time of the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty was about the same civilizational, same development level as the Roman Empire. There was that in the 6th century, as Europe went into to the Middle Ages. Certainly China was more advanced. And then beginning in the 16th century, Europe begins its superdrive, and then with industrialization in the 19th century, then the differentials become bigger and bigger. And so what happens? Why is it that Europe keeps growing, getting more and more powerful? And then there's this shift because in Europe there's this a strong focus on sovereignty and nationalism, and that's this balance of power world that existed through most of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And that system was stable for most of the 19th century, but in the beginning of the 20th century, with these power shifts, and we'll come back to this in a moment, but the power shift was rising Germany in Europe. So rising Germany upset the balance of power so much that old system that had lasted for about 100 years since the Congress of Vienna in 1815 started to break down. And that's what World War I was about. That's what World War II was about, these strong nationalisms. And the post-war planners, during the end of the war and immediately after the war, came to this conclusion that sovereignty and nationalism and a world constructed on balance of power was an inherently unstable world. And what we should do to address that is build overlapping sovereignties. And that's why we have institutions like the United Nations, like NATO, like the World Bank and the IMF. And the whole idea is that we're going to tie countries together and have a different developmental model coming out of the destruction of the war than we've had in the past. And it's been extremely successful. This last 70 years, 71 years, I guess almost 72 years, since the end of the war, has been probably the most peaceful, and it's certainly been the period with the most human development in the history of the time of our species on Earth. So it's been an unbelievable success, and here are the features of the post-war world, this many ways US guaranteed world, open markets, global standards, free navigation. I mean, we are here in the middle of nowhere, and we don't think that our security right now is being guaranteed by the United States Navy. Just because you look out, you go up on the 12th floor, you don't see them. But that is what's guaranteeing our safe passage, even though we don't feel it. That's this structure that we are in, this U.S. security umbrella. U.S. has a treaty alliance with Australia. I don't know if we're yet in Australian waters, but all of those guarantees of why people in international relations behave in a certain way often, most of the time, there are these structures that you don't always see, but you know that they're there. And this focus on individual rights. And there's so China, coming out of the Second World War, China was under the nationalists because in 1910 there had been the Republican Revolution of Sun Yat-sen. And then during the Second World War, under the nationalists, the Japanese pushed far into China, but they were fought by the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, in association, working closely with the United States and others. And after the war, the communists, who hadn't done much of the fighting in the Second World War, defeated the nationalists who retreated to Taiwan. So 1949, the Chinese Communist Party assumes power over all of China, except for Taiwan. There are major purges, and then for a long period of time, China turns inward. First, there are large numbers, a couple of million, of executions and the class war immediately after the revolution. Then the Great Leap Forward, which was agricultural collectivization, which led to the death of some 30 to 40 million people. And then the Cultural Revolution. And all of this was tied into the personality of Mao Zedong, who was this very charismatic, and I would certainly say very sinister and certainly very murderous leader of China. So China, this great civilization with this incredible, glorious history, turns itself inward and kind of comes off of the map. And as we talked about in our session yesterday, Japan and then the other Asian tigers, they start to have their economic development miracle. And China is really left out. And after Mao dies, there's an internal power struggle. And in 1978, this guy, Deng Xiaoping, who'd been close to power and then purged, then close to power and purged again, finally he comes to power, and he begins the economic reforms that create the China that we know today. So GDP, you don't have to look, you can just get the trend line. GDP post-Deng, that's this takeoff, and it's been roughly 10% per year for the past 30 years, which is an incredible level of growth, far faster. The United States' biggest growth spurt was between the Civil War and World War I. And then China has done more and faster than we did, even at the height of our growth. Trade is certainly very, very important, and trade takes a big jump in 2001 when China joins the World Trade Organization. And many of you, if you shop at Walmart, and that ease of exchange of goods and China as part of of global manufacturing, that really comes out of the hard work of the Chinese people and the smart work of the Chinese government, but also the access to global markets that has come through China joining the WTO, World Trade Organization, in 2001. And before I talk about some of the things that are very concerning, I'm a human rights person. I've worked in human rights for many, many years. And I always say that while China does a lot of, in my view, bad things in the world, for those of us who care about human rights, we should be jumping for joy that China, over these last 30, 40 years, has brought about 700 million people out of abject poverty. And when you compare China, which is that red line, versus India, which hasn't done so much, or Brazil, it's really incredibly impressive what China has done. And so for all of those people who were living at subsistence, who now are living middle class or lower middle class lives, I mean, that's a really monumental achievement. Mass urbanization. China has moved from a rural society to an urban society. Over the last 30 years, they've brought about 300 million people from the countryside into the cities, and there are plans to bring 300 million more, which is basically the entire population of the United States, into cities over the next 10 years. So what's happening in China is truly revolutionary. And the GDP, and we'll talk about in a moment how it's slowing, continues to grow, and estimates are that by around 2030, China will have the largest economy in the world, larger than the United States. The United States will still have 4 times a greater per capita GDP, per person GDP, and there's a debate, and some people say, well, total GDP doesn't matter, it's per capita GDP is what matters, but nobody says that Liechtenstein is a superpower. And so I think that being the largest economy, being the largest economy in the world is actually pretty significant. It's significant just because of how people think. We talked with the ships. It's like mental maps have a lot of influence over how we think. But of late, GDP growth has begun to go down, and it's gone down very significantly. The official numbers today are in the 6s. I happen to believe that those numbers are fabrications, just because the Chinese GDP numbers are very much politicized. So I would guess it's maybe 2 percentage points lower, 4-5%, which is still, by our standards, pretty good. But for what they need to do, for where they are in their developmental curve, they need to have pretty significant economic growth, or else it's likely that they could have other kinds of social problems, which they're beginning to have. And one of the problems that they are having is capital flight, that many people in China don't have confidence in the future of the Chinese system. They don't have confidence in the currency. They don't have confidence in the government. And so people are trying to get their money out. And it's very different from maybe 10 years ago. People would have, when I spoke to people in China, they said, why would we get our money out? The growth is here. And the Chinese economy has stopped that period of crazy growth. And now people are very, very worried. And there are all kinds of capital restrictions that are designed to keep money inside of China. But in spite of that, there is more and more money leaving China, which is, and we'll talk a moment about what some of the implications of that are. So it's this very interesting situation where there has been tremendous economic growth, there's decent economic growth, but there are warning signs. And when you have, I saw somebody this morning who was wearing their Berkshire Hathaway sweatshirt, and Warren Buffett always says, it's only when the tide is going out that you realize who's not wearing a swimming suit. And so now, when you have 10% growth covers a lot of sins. But when growth is starting to slow and people are starting to get worried, then a lot of questions arise. And one of the most important questions that arises is about the legitimacy of the Chinese government. So the Chinese government, as I mentioned before, came to power by force. There was no election, there was no constitution that the country voted on. It happened by force in 1949. And today, there are 3 sources, I would argue, of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Connection to the revolution, economic growth, and nationalism. So connection to the revolution, how many, raise your hand if you've been to Tiananmen Square? Wow. Okay, so a lot of you have been to Tiananmen Square. At Tiananmen Square, there's this picture of Mao. As I said before, it's not that controversial. Maybe it's a little controversial to say that Mao killed tens of millions of people. I think that it's probably in the 40s. Some people may say it's the 30s. Some people may say it's in the 20s. But tens of millions of people by really any count. And the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, the official line is that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. So why keep Mao's picture there? Like, why not just get rid of it and say, hey, we're like, if you've killed 70 million people, chances are most everybody has a relative who died because they were starved to death or murdered or whatever during the Great Leap Forward or some other period. So why keep it? You're only agitating people. And the reason is because the legitimacy of the party comes from their connection to this glorious Chinese revolution. And if they get rid of that myth, then people say, what are you doing here? So holding on to that connection to the revolution and to Mao is extremely, extremely important. And that's why there's enormous suppression of news and information about the Great Leap Forward and about many aspects of the Cultural Revolution. But economic growth is probably the most important thing that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government has delivered that makes people say, well, we're willing to give up some of our political rights in exchange for economic growth, in exchange for a better quality of life, especially people who've lived through wars and famines, and people are just happy to have stability and some security and economic opportunity. But there are a lot of headwinds that make maintaining that perception extremely difficult for the Chinese government. The first is an aging population. Again, you don't need to read any of the words here, but you can just see the trend line. Right now, 9% of the Chinese population is over 65. In 2050, that's going to be 25%. So this is the most rapidly aging population in world history. And the reason for that, as you all know, is the one-child policy that was instituted by the government in the 1970s because they were afraid of overpopulation and overdrag on resources. So and Japan has a somewhat similar aging curve, but Japan got rich before it got old. China, in many ways, is getting old before, on a per capita basis, it gets rich. The second very important shortfall, and it touches on a lot of things we're going to discuss in a moment, is China's natural resource shortfall. China is very wealthy in people. Some of the most talented, brilliant people in the world are in China. But in terms of natural resources, water is extremely important. China only has 1/4 of the global per capita access to fresh water. And almost every major natural resource that they need for industrialization, copper, aluminum, arable land. China has a very small amount of arable land relative to the size of its population. Oil needs to be imported, and you can just go on forever in this list. And it creates it's very dangerous because the Chinese government needs to maintain these inputs in order to keep economic growth happening. And that puts them in a very vulnerable position. And if it's not bad, that's not bad enough, limited resources, there's a massive problem of misallocation of resources. And we'll talk a bit more about this, but starting with political power, because it's a centralized party system. And so once you have political power, you can leverage that for access to all of these other things, state resources, natural resources, capital, opportunity. So China has this incredibly vibrant population, but it's not tapping that population as much as it could because access to capital, access to all kinds of resources is politicized, and therefore it's much less of a meritocracy than it needs to be. And Chinese leaders are the first to state that China's growth model as currently exists is not sustainable. And that's normal. There are lots of economies that in the first phase, and you look at Korea as a good example, South Korea. In the first phase, there was a centralized authoritarian structure. Taiwan is the same. And those kinds of systems are very good at doing certain things. They're very good at building infrastructure. Like the United States is terrible at building infrastructure, but these centralized societies are very good at building infrastructure. They're very good at harnessing labor and low-cost labor and suppressing wages so you can do things like export goods very competitively. And China certainly has done that very well. And so it's not that the economy didn't work in China's last phase of economic growth. It did. The question is to get from that first phase of economic growth where, frankly, the Soviet Union did pretty well in the early years, North Korea did pretty well in the early years of that first phase of economic growth. But to get from that first phase of growth to the second phase of growth that's based on creativity and innovation and all of those things that are hard to put your arms around, you need to change the way you do business. And China right now is kind of stuck. It's trying to get around it, but it's kind of stuck in that model that got them from where they were to where they are. And it's an over-reliance on exports and fixed investments, overcapacity, low productivity, state-owned enterprises sucking up energy, growing debt, we'll talk about, repressed consumption, corruption, inequality, wasted resources, environmental damage. And all of this adds up to what economists call a middle-income trap. And what that means is that there are, historically, many economies have done pretty well at this first phase of economic growth, but to get over that hump from be a middle-income country to a high-income country, like Korea has done, like Singapore has done, like Taiwan has done, you need to start developing a different set of rules, a different set of reflexes, a different set of institutions, and a different way of thinking. And that's very, very difficult for any society to do. And right now, we're seeing examples of how the old system is trying to hang on. And these bad loans, where China has a debt to GDP ratio of nearing, it's about 250, a little higher than 250%, which in the IMF, that's cause for alarm. And the reason is, one of the reasons is they have these many big corporations, including state-run corporations, that have made politically important investments that may not make enormous economic sense. And because the banks are connected to the state and the large businesses are connected to the state, if you make a bad investment, you can always get the next loan because you're all connected to the state and you're a major employer, and so the state doesn't want to have the problem of unemployment. And so what you have is these loans rolling over and over, and that creates a very, very dangerous. So the debt burden in China is growing to dangerous levels. And because of this state problem, this misallocation of political power, what you have is, even though there is economic growth, people's quality of life, their perceived quality of life, is not increasing. And it kind of makes sense because people feel like it's like what happened with this U.S. election. If you say, well, U.S. economy is growing, we're creating jobs, but for the people, the workers in the northern, some northern states, they said, well, that may be the case for the country. It's not the case for me. And in China, there are many people who are feeling like, well, the economy is growing, but the level of inequality is tremendous and growing among the worst in the world, and so I'm not benefiting from it. So there's a big problem of people's quality of life stagnating. The president of China, as many of you know, is named Xi Jinping. He is now in year 4 of his first 5-year term. And Xi Jinping and his cohorts have some really smart, well-thought-out reform plans of empowering consumption, of going from an economy that's manufacturing and export to innovating and consuming, controlling debt, as we talked about, consolidating state-owned enterprises, increasing productivity, which has gone way, way down productivity per capita, per worker, enhancing rule by law, which is a bit different from rule of law, altering the provincial financial structure because there's a strange relationship of the center and the provinces, which is why traditionally the provinces were taking land from workers and giving it to developers, and that was how they were supporting themselves, but it was angering a lot of workers and farmers. Very importantly, market pricing the resources. People will use resources based on market prices, improving water and air quality. You've all seen the pictures of Beijing and other cities, and certainly I've been in Beijing where literally, like I was 50 feet from a massive Ferris wheel and I couldn't see it. You can't see across the street. You hold your hand in front of your face and you can hardly see that. It's unbelievable. And fighting systemic corruption and inequality. So China's leaders know what the problems are, and they've got great plans. But there's a problem. And that problem is that reform in any system can happen and should happen and has to happen, in my view, in two ways, from top down and the bottom up. So all these plans that I just described, those are top-down plans. But bottom up requires empowering people to be their own advocates. And in China, because the political system is repressive, there's a tremendous fear among those at the top that if we empower people on the bottom to fight for their own rights, that maybe we're not going to be able to contain it. Once people get a taste that this is the way you can solve your problems, they're going to want to solve all of their problems in that way. And so that's why China's leaders are saying, well, we're going to fix this with this top-down approach, but every time the people from the bottom begin to rally, and whether it's after the Sichuan earthquake because there was such shoddy construction, or the Three Gorges Dam, which was an environmental disaster when all these farmers were dispossessed from their land, or with the tainted blood scandal, when people were blood donors were being infected with HIV/AIDS. Whenever that happens and people begin to organize, they are immediately crushed by the provincial or the central authorities because the fear of empowering the bottom is so great. And it creates this reform conundrum because it's the people at the top who are the greatest beneficiaries of the system who are also saying, well, let us be the ones who fix the system. And that raises this question about whose dream. So when Xi Jinping came to power, he said we have this new thing that called the Chinese dream, and it's this, we're going to help realize everybody's aspirations. And so these guys thought, well, let's test it out. And they went to Beijing, and they unfurled this banner and says, if officials are corrupt, the Chinese dream will remain a daydream. And of course, these guys were beaten and arrested. In 2013, an internal memorandum required teachers to avoid what are called the 7 unmentionable topics: universal values, press freedom, civil society, citizens' rights, the party's historical aberrations, we talked about Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, privileged capitalist class, and independence of the judiciary. So again, there's this fear that if people get infected with these concepts, that they are not going to be controllable. And so China today is balancing, and China's leaders, who are very smart, capable people, are trying to balance these different impulses. One is reform versus stimulus. It's funny, I was looking at this slide, and I was trying to say it's like you can either eat healthy food like strawberries, or you can eat unhealthy food like ice cream. And then I thought, we're on a cruise. You can eat whatever you want. But outside of the cruise, or if you're talking to your children or your grandchildren, you say, like, eat your broccoli, because the broccoli is good for you. But you could get your children or grandchildren, they kind of want to eat, like I want to eat, the ice cream. And so China knows very well that it needs to reform its economy. But it's very, very difficult to swallow that bitter pill, because that bitter pill means slower growth. It means letting companies like these very inefficient state-owned enterprises fail. And it means a period of uncertainty where they may not have these kinds of economic growth they've had in the past, but legitimacy is connected to that level of growth. So it's a very difficult balance. Control versus markets. I had a little bit of fame last year in the beginning of the year because I kept going on CNN and Bloomberg, and I was saying this the Chinese stock market is a bubble and it's going to pop. And people say, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, it's like 20 times the valuations of the S&P index. All of my friends in China are saying you have some little boring company that's making cereal, and you put up a website, and then you say, oh, now we're a tech company, and your valuation goes up 10 times. Like, it was crazy. And then, of course, the bubble burst. And why was there a bubble in the first place? Well, it was because there was so much, the companies were so indebted that the government had this idea that if we talk up the stock market, these companies are going to be able to shift their debt into equity. And so the Chinese government was saying everyone should invest in the stock market, and people said, well, if the government is saying we should do it, we should do it. So there was this frenzy of all these people who were not experienced investors throwing their money into the stock market. And then, of course, the bubble burst. And the Chinese government is in this very difficult position. If you let the bubble burst, you create some discipline in the market. But you also have all of these mom and pop people who you've been saying you should get into the market are vulnerable. And China, in 2013, Xi Jinping said we need to market price our resources. And you need markets to market price resources. And they thought they could fix all of these things by talking up the stock market. But what did they do at the crisis? They froze the valuations of companies. They got the Chinese, the big brokerages were forced to buy stocks. Everything was frozen. And so there's this constant pull between control, which the party requires, and markets, and freeing up the economy so that all these incredibly talented people who I mentioned can realize their aspirations in a market. And there's now versus later. There's what are the things that we need to do to lay the foundation for the future versus what are the things that we need to do now to keep economic growth rolling in the short term. So China today has this very, very dangerous balance, because if growth stops, there are questions of the legitimacy of the government. But if they don't reform, the dangers are getting larger and larger. And so the economic model becomes less sustainable. The possibility of some kind of market crisis becomes greater. And that's the big question is, can these reforms work? But for the reforms work, they have to start. And in these last 4 years, while the plans have been very good, the implementation of those plans has been very bad for all of the reasons that I described. And the Chinese political system, by custom, not by law, the president and the party leader have 2 5-year terms. And so Xi Jinping is coming up next year, will be the end of his first term. And to date, these reforms haven't really happened, but there has been a major process called their anti-corruption campaign, which hasn't really cracked down on corruption, in my view, but it's been a political campaign allowing Xi Jinping to consolidate his power. And next year, the Party Congress at the end of the year will be his opportunity to put his people, so many people in the Chinese government are connected to his 2 predecessors, to put his people into position of authority. And there's this enormous debate among China watchers, is that happens, will he be a reformer, which it could happen, or as I believe, is if you behave a certain way now, you're going to behave a certain way in the future, because there are always reasons not to reform. There are always tremendous political pressures, but we will see. But the problem, again, as I see it, is this thing of the foxes guarding the chicken coop. Because the Chinese Communist Party, in addition to the very murderous first decades, at least in the last few decades, has done a tremendous job of stewarding China's economy to where it is today. And they've been part of the solution for economic growth, even though they've done it in a way that I think many of us in this room would be uncomfortable with. But the party sees itself as the solution. But it may very well be that at this stage of economic growth, trying to get over that middle income trap, that the party itself is the problem. The party itself is the thing that is interfering with unleashing this tremendous power, this tremendous ability of the Chinese people. And because the infrastructure of the party is weak, the infrastructure itself, it's a pyramidal system. And I always say corruption is not a cancer on the Chinese Communist Party. Corruption is the essence of the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't mean that facetiously. What I mean is the way that you get something done in a democratic system is you are in this role, and there are all these people who listen to you because of the structure. In the Chinese system, by and large, it's a system where the Chinese word is guangxi. And so it's basically you have a pyramidal structure of people who are part of your network. And the way you get things done is you have people who owe their careers and their lives and their loyalty to you. And that's why now, as I said, this next party Congress is so important, because Xi Jinping needs to get his people into power in order to realize those aspirations. So it's a very different kind of system. So I talked about the first two drivers of legitimacy, and the third one is rising nationalism. And that is something that's being fed by the Chinese Communist Party, in part because with economic problems, it diverts people's attention, and in part because China is growing. I talked about the lack of natural resources, and they need to go out to get those natural resources. And to do that, they need a military that is able to defend their ability to maintain the acquisition of what they need. So right now in Asia, and I'm speeding up a little bit because I know we're running towards the end, and I apologize for that. So right now in Asia, in some ways, there are these two models of the future, and there are two models of China. One is the Dr. Jekyll model of driver of economic growth, and the other is the Mr. Hyde model, which is these competing nationalisms and a very, very dangerous, very combustible situation with China playing a much greater role in places like the South China Sea and East China Sea. And I talked about this yesterday, where China is claiming essentially the entirety of the South China Sea, being very aggressive militarily. In the East China Sea, pushing against Japan and the United States. Big problems with cyber theft. Russia has been in the news lately, but Chinese government-connected entities have been stealing massive amounts of intellectual property around the world, giving it to Chinese companies to create a competitive advantage. North Korea, I've spent a lot of time working on North Korea issues. North Korea exists because of the support of the Chinese, and even though China doesn't like what's happening with nuclear weapons, China is the only country that could stop it, and for political reasons and strategic reasons choose not to do so. Environmental issues are certainly very, very important. And that brings us to this. So it's probably good that we only have a few more minutes. Because if you're going to leave, you were going to leave anyway. And so as I said in the beginning, the United States has played this role as the primary guarantor of the international system. And even before this election, that system was under fundamental threat, particularly because China was rising so rapidly and so aggressively and didn't necessarily buy into every aspect of that post-war international order. But now we have an incoming president of the United States who has said that he's not going to respect our alliances, at least in the ways that all presidents before him have done. He's said that he encourages Japan and Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons, which is in contravention of decades of U.S. policy. There's a massive move, which I don't quite understand, in the direction of Russia and picking fights with China. And so there are many around the world who are at very least questioning whether President-elect Trump is committed to maintaining this global infrastructure that has supported the peace and prosperity of the last 70 years. That doesn't mean that he necessarily won't. It just means that in every capital in the world, people are asking that question. And so it's clear that with a rising China and America still needing to play an important role in the world, and we're 70 years after the war, we're going to need common rules of the road. We're going to need inclusive institutions that bring all countries together with a greater level of equality than we've had in the past. And new institutions, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that China has created. The United States, I think, stupidly opposed it. But now the new institutions are important to really tie the world together the way that the post-war planners tied the world together in 1945 with stronger regional institutions. There's not a NATO of Asia. A lot of the things, there's not an EU in Asia. A lot of those kinds of structures are what we're going to need, but it's very, very difficult to create them. And what we're moving to is a world that has been this post-war world to this post-war world. And the new world seems to me that's being created looks very much like the world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where the institutions were weak, where we had countries that were competing with each other. There was a rising power that was Germany. In this case, it's China, and China and Russia, for that matter. And we're entering to a very, very dangerous period, which brings us back to our friend Antonio Gramsci, and that the old world is dying, this new world has not yet emerged, and in the twilight rise up monsters. And the twilight, unfortunately, is where it feels like we are heading. But that just means that we all collectively have a lot of work. So, xie. Thank you very much. I'm going to stick around. I'm so sorry that I didn't have time for questions. I really value them. I'm going to stick around here if you have questions, and then please just stop me anywhere on the ship because I really want to answer your questions as there was a lot of ground to cover. So thank you all so much.